Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Flash Talk. I'm really excited about today. We have a presentation from Angel Adams Parham. She is the Reverend Joseph H. Victor S.J. Distinguished Professor of Social Science and Associate Professor of Sociology at Loyola University, New Orleans. She's an award-winning scholar of comparative and historical sociology of race, and the author of the 2017 book, American Roots, Racial Palimpsests and the Transformation of Race. We're gonna have a discussant. Anna Skarpelis is a sociologist. She's breaking new ground at the intersection of qualitative and computational methods and comparative historical sociology. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Weatherhead Scholars Program at Harvard University and starting a new computational postdoc at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin. Her current project is titled Unwanted Race, Sovereignty, and the Governance of Expendable Populations. Thank you both so much for agreeing to do this. And I'm going to turn things over to Angel.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks for everyone who's able to come and for everyone who will later be listening on the recorded version. So very happy to be here with you. Go ahead and start by sharing my screen. All right, so I'm going to be speaking with you about Le Souvenir on layered racial memory. And 1 second, I just need to start my timer so that I am cognizant of time. Okay, so how do we read our landscape? You know, this has been something that's been very much at the forefront of our politics for the past several years. And how we read monuments and other kinds of public spaces has been at the forefront of this. Here you have an excerpt from Mayor Mitch Landrieu during a speech he gave in 2017, explaining why he was determined to bring down 4 Confederate monuments in the city. I can't go into it in great detail, but suffice it to say, he had a very hard time getting these monuments down, partly because no one would rent a crane to him. The construction companies in the city basically felt that they would have a lot of very bad press if they brought these down with their cranes. And in fact, when he did get one bid that was willing to give him a crane, that person's car was firebombed. So it was certainly a very, very contentious situation. So was this the right decision? Some argue that it was the wrong decision. And, you know, certainly, of course, those who are on the alt-right or far-right, who have problems with bringing down Confederate monuments would be one group who would be against it, but there are others who are more sympathetic to issues of race and justice who also suggest that perhaps it's not right to bring them down. Here is part of an article that was written by historian Mary Mitchell and her co-author Amber Nicholson, and so they are arguing that actually it's better to keep them in sight so that it makes us have a conversation, have a public conversation about these issues. So much of our national discourse has suggested that there are really just 2 ways of approaching this, that we're going to either efface or we're going to conserve. We're going to erase from the landscape or we're going to keep on the landscape. And this is because so much of our public discussion is polarized as well. So polarized around race, for instance. This is from an older study by historians Rosenzweig and Thelen, who looked at the ways that Americans remember and the ways that they think about history. And in part of their work, in the survey work that they did, in their discussions with Black and white respondents, they found that there are very fundamentally different ways that most of their Black respondents compared to most of their white respondents were dealing with issues of history. So for Black respondents, they would start out by talking about family history, but then they would very quickly link that to national stories of, say, the civil rights movement or slavery. They found that white respondents, on the other hand, generally would think and talk in terms of their own family history, but never really make those linkages to larger national narratives of inequality. And they found that Native Americans were very similar to Black Americans in the way they related to the history of making local and national linkages. And we're also quite polarized by political and ideological perspectives. So this is a quote from Take 'em Down NOLA, which was supporting the mayor in taking down the Confederate statues. But then, of course, you have others. This one, for instance, is arguing that Confederate statues should stay. And what's very interesting about this entry from the Federalist is that it occurred just days after the Unite the Right protest and violence in Charlottesville in 2017. So they're writing this right in the midst of the violence that is occurring there. So what I want to do is to suggest a different way that we might be able to address this. And so I've used this concept of the lieu de souvenir to do this, and it's both a concept and a method. So as a concept, lieux de souvenir are places whose past have not been remembered or have only been very partially remembered. And as a method of historical inquiry, the approach proceeds by systematically uncovering layers of the past within a very specific, tightly defined site or place, with the goal of placing the past into ongoing conversation with the present. And so my hope is that with this approach, that the lieu de souvenir approach would invite us to ask the questions of who have we been, who are we now, and who do we desire to be for the future? So when I think, for instance, about the controversy over the Confederate sites here in New Orleans, rather than thinking only in terms of removing or keeping them, I suggest this as a possibility, that what we might do in that particular case, I do think that there is a good argument for bringing that photo that I showed you was Lee, General Robert E. Lee. I do think there's a good argument for bringing the Lee statue down. However, I also think there is room for keeping some kind of marker there that keeps it as part of the conversation. So say, for instance, that they decided to put, I don't know, Louis Armstrong there. Some people have suggested maybe Louis Armstrong. Okay, so you have a new very large Louis Armstrong there at that circle where it used to be Robert E. Lee. But somewhere at the ground level, beneath the pedestal where the new statue is erected, you have something that shows you the image of the old statue. And that gives you some of the history of how it came to be, the controversies over it and how it came down. And that also has a QR code that is connected to it that takes people to a very engaging website, with scholarly interviews, sound design, and so on, that helps to draw people into that history. And so in that way, it would be a way that people could continue to interact with and enter into the longer term history of that site and into the long-term conversation. And so that's the kind of thing that is intentionally creating layered sites of memory that people can interact with very well. So I see 4 dimensions of the lieu de souvenir. It's a concept, and as a concept, I think of this as describing a site that's amenable to layered analysis, which has an illuminating story to tell about transformations in geography, social status, and power. As a unit of analysis, it could be almost anything. A building, a neighborhood, even a nation could be a unit of analysis. As a research method and mode of analysis, it combines aspects of history, geography, and archaeology with insights from sociological thinking. And as a way of seeing, it cultivates curiosity about how the current landscape came to be and what social, cultural, and political struggles were involved in creating what we see today. So I think it could be helpful just to clarify what I mean by lieu de souvenir by contrasting it with some similar concepts that are different from what lieu de souvenir are. So the first would be the lieu de mémoire of Pierre Noroy, which is very well known, and which I draw on, but use it in a very different way. It's kind of a conceptual cousin of Noroy. So the lieu de mémoire from Noroy tend to concentrate and strengthen community and identity, while lieu de souvenir disaggregate dominant ideas of community and identity. And in his conception, the lieu de mémoire generally emerge once a community is feeling somewhat insecure or defensive about their sense of self as a cultural community. And so monuments or events or commemorations are then meant to bolster and support that cultural memory. Whereas with le de souvenir, the idea is actually to disaggregate and to bring to the forefront what has been forgotten or contested so that it becomes subject to public conversation and attempts to build bridges across differences. So their tendencies are quite different. There's also the idea of a site of conscience, and some sites of conscience are le de souvenir, but not necessarily all of them. So for instance, sites of conscience are generally places where some kind of violence has happened, genocide or war or Native American boarding schools. Le de souvenir don't necessarily have to be places where there's some kind of tragic or traumatic memory, not necessarily. So the reason that I propose the le de mémoire is as a way, as I said, to bring to the forefront aspects of contested memory, is as we know from Maurice Halbwach's work on collective memory, we're often so very shaped by our social group membership when we're thinking about and recalling our memories and understanding and making sense of history. There are some who argue that it's actually better to forget. So Renan, for instance, in What is a Nation says, it's actually better to forget because so many nations have been consolidated through violence. And if you keep remembering that violence, it's just going to tear you apart. Others like Adorno recognize the concern, but argue that you have to continue working through the past because the issues keep coming up precisely because they haven't been worked through. And so just ignoring them is not really going to be helpful to the community overall. Under certain circumstances, Mistal argues that memory can be helpful for democracy when we're taking a critical and an open approach, as opposed to, say, an approach that promotes nostalgia, and where we're engaging in reflexive public recollection that is open to ideas of justice and inclusion. So that is, in a sense, she recognizes some of the concerns of Renan, but says, under certain circumstances, if we're doing it well, cultivating memory can be helpful to democracy. In terms of race and memory, I've always been captured by Douglas's construction that racism is a kind of diseased imagination and a kind of diseased way of thinking about ourselves and of thinking about the past that infects our life together. And Du Bois in The Propaganda of History also talks about this, about how there's this remarkable tendency of Americans to want to just skim over the difficult parts of the past, right? To skim over difficult aspects of, say, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson in relationship to their slave ownership and their thoughts about race. So why is it that there is this interest in kind of skimming over? And I think a lot of it has to do with not being willing to grapple with collective trauma. And this trauma of slavery and racism doesn't fit into the kind of neat national narrative of opportunity and success. And this is what Olick argues in part of his work in The Politics of Regret. And David Blight in Race and Reunion also discusses this, that the memory of slavery, emancipation, the 14th and 15th Amendments don't fit very well with these kind of romanticized notions of the past. So what I want to suggest is that we use le de souvenir to cultivate or to retrain our imagination. So going back to Frederick Douglass's conception of racism as the result of a diseased imagination. So if we could use these particular sites, these le de souvenir, as a way of cultivating both the historical and the social imagination. So I want to say more about what those are. So the historical imagination, then, I would describe as the capacity to reflect on the events and meanings of the past by identifying and examining key documents, places, and sites that are then intentionally put into conversation with each other, with the present, and with our potential futures. And the social imagination I describe as the capacity to understand how our lives are shaped by social structures, where this capacity informs our understanding of human flourishing and widens our circles of social concern. So I want to say a little bit more about social imagination and where this comes from. It is a combination of the sociological imagination and the moral imagination. I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with the sociological imagination, so I'll just kind of describe the idea of the moral imagination, which comes more out of philosophical literature. I like philosopher John Keats's approach, where he describes the moral imagination as our capacity for making pictures or images of the good life, and then coming to resemble those pictures through a process of self-evaluation that enlarges our understanding about the possibilities open to us. Right? And so again, the idea is for our study of and reflection on le souvenir to cultivate our historical and social imaginations. And the hope is that in training or retraining the social and historical imaginations, that we might be able to work toward turning strangers into friends. And here I draw on the work of some political theorists. So for instance, Danielle Allen in Talking to Stranger, where she is talking about the continued racial gap and antagonism following Brown v. Board of Education. She writes, citizens on each side of the ethno-political divide during the civil rights movement had difficulty imagining a future together. Political friendship cultivates habits of imagination that generate politically transformed experiences out of ordinary interactions among strangers. To develop a cultural habit of such friendship would transform our political world. She in turn draws on the work of Aristotle from the Nicomachean Ethics, and from a particular discussion that he has in the chapter on friendship. And there he details several different kinds of friendship, one kind being political friendship. And in that construction, he says particularly that he could imagine that you could have this kind of political friendship amongst about 99,000 people. And that when it gets much bigger than that, it's harder to conceptualize. And so I think of that or translate that in terms of le souvenir and local sites as being perhaps, depending on how dense the places where you live, maybe within about a 5 to 7 mile circumference of where you live, right? That sites within that 5 to 7 mile circumference, maybe a little further, could be places where people could come together in seeing that landscape and its history differently in a way that helps to train and retrain the social and the historical imagination. So I have a particular research vision that I am hoping comes out of this work. So for research that historical and comparative historical sociologists would see the le souvenir concept as something useful to add to their toolkit. Educationally, for universities in partnership with towns and cities to create accessible digital and place-based tools that invite the public to see in layered and nuanced ways that help to encourage civic dialogue. And in terms of vision and imagination, for this approach to make it so that when people even just walk down the street, that they're thinking about their landscape in new and more nuanced ways, and ways that push them to think about different layers of history that led to what they are seeing now. So in the last few minutes, I want to introduce one of the cases from this so you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. This is the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel here in New Orleans. This is what it looks like today down in the French Quarter. This is a document from the early 19th century from Pierre Maspero and the settling of his estate. So he died in a great deal of debt, and this generated lots of paperwork, to list out everything in his estate and figure out who had claim to what. And it gives us a very interesting sense of what was going on and what he was doing at this exchange. So the exchange was a place where people would go to buy and sell many different kinds of things. It was a kind of hangout place, a coffee shop, a marketplace. It had all sorts of different functions there. So this is from some of that paperwork at his estate. And this is just somebody who is laying claim to property that was at the exchange at the time of Pierre Maspero's death and trying to reclaim their property at the time. This is a newspaper article or announcement from L'Abeille, one of the French language newspapers here, which is saying that on this date at 12 o'clock at the Exchange Coffee House will be sold a sugar plantation together with 34 slaves. Okay, so you can see, again, just to get a sense of how this worked as an exchange, many, many different kinds of things, including people, were sold at this exchange. This is the site of the current hotel. Here's another one, which is announcing the sale of a woman named Susan and her children, Thomas. And who's the other one? And Susan. Okay, so her daughter has the same name. And this is from the English-speaking Times-Picayune. At this time, both French and English were spoken in the city. So another use was that they had a newsroom there. And you could, for $10 a year, subscribe to the magazines and the newspapers that they would bring in to the city exchange. So again, it's kind of this all in one place to hang out, to get the news, to read the newspapers, to sell slaves. It's kind of all one thing wrapped up together for the patrons there. And this was just the normal business. Once emancipation occurs, this is from 1871, the place is reorganized as the St. Louis Hotel. Unfortunately for them, it was not financially viable, and so after 2 years, it went bankrupt. However, there were multiple attempts to reconstruct this as a hotel, and so later in the 19th century, it was recreated as the Hotel Royal, and this is from the guest ledger. You can see people who have signed in there, and that was marginally more successful, although that one also failed financially before the current hotel whose picture I showed you. By the early 20th century, what was called then the Old St. Louis Hotel had gained, this status of myth, and there was this interest in, kind of the glory days of the hotel when it had been this great exchange. Selling all kinds of things. It was a very beautiful, ornate place architecturally, very rich looking. And so you had this series of postcards to celebrate that past. Of course, it was not considered a celebration for those who had been sold there, but in the popular imagination, the Old St. Louis Hotel and the exchange that came before it were very much celebrated. So this is a postcard to a woman named Caroline. This is a close-up, and you can see a little bit of the description of the Old St. Louis Hotel, and it talks about a place that was unequaled for its splendor and magnificence. Interestingly, on the back of this same postcard to Miss Caroline, you get this message. Dear Caroline, Aunt Sandy will tell you a story about this quaint old place when Negroes were to be sold as slaves. So this is from 1907. So it gives you a sense in the early 20th century, the way that the average person or tourist or resident was interacting with the memory of this place. Here's another very different kind of postcard from, it has a picture of a woman who said that she was sold on the slave block at the hotel. And keep your eye on the arches there as you look at this next photo. So this is today. So this is just a few months ago when I took the photo, the back of the hotel, and you can see just very barely there the outlines of the word exchange from its older days. And that is where indeed enslaved persons were bought and sold. It was only just in, I believe it was 2018, that a plaque was finally affixed right to the back of the hotel, right next to these arches, explaining what used to take place at the hotel. But of course, it's so located that no guests are really going to see it unless they have reason to go around to the back to the loading dock, which is right where this plaque is located. And so this brings us back again to today's hotel. So I'll wrap up by saying that it's important that we make these connections between history, imagination, and civic life, especially because some of our most fundamental divides over these past several years have been played out largely over conflicting understandings or interpretations of history. Think about Make America Great Again, the 1619 Project, and then the rebuttal of the 1619 Project by a group of Black intellectuals called 1776 Unites. And so my argument would be for training and retraining the social and historical imagination, working toward dialogue and away from a polarized monologue, not by ignoring problematic aspects of our past, but by bringing them to the fore in a way that helps us to engage in difficult discussions in order to bridge divides and to bridge our local understandings with our national narratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. I am now going to hand things over to our discussant.
Thanks for that, Sarah, and thanks for organizing this. This is such a beautiful paper. As I was listening to this and I was kind of furtively glancing at my comments that I've pulled up to the right side, kind of came to realize that I'm going to feel really terrible in a minute because you're so positive and optimistic. And I, as somebody who was raised in Germany and is kind of like, 60, 70, 80 years after, denazification, I'm just, a negative Nelly at this point. So my comments come from this very personally localized history rather than from any preemptive defeat regarding the possibilities of rethinking how to engage with the past in the United States, which I hope will go a lot better than it did in countries like Germany or France or Japan. But anyway, fantastic paper. And I also love this kind of combination of the scholarly and the activist approach that we see all too rarely. So let me go into my comments. So Angel Parham diagnoses the contemporary situation in the US as one in which there are two ways of dealing with contentious monuments. There's either the opportunity to remove them or to conserve them. Parham sees these as contrasting and polarizing and proposes a concept and historical approach that she calls lieu de souvenir, in which places currently not known for their history are revealed to have layered histories. Turning a site like General Lee's statue into a lieu de souvenir would entail removing the statue, replacing it with a different type of physical manifestation, and then providing information about the original statue, the controversy that ensued around it, and what came to replace it. In that, lieu de souvenir will enable a, quote, ongoing conversation between past and present, end of quote. Something just like what Angel Parham proposes in theory is currently on literal display in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, right next door to where I'm sitting. The museum recently made the decision to remove the Theodore Roosevelt statue that towers in front of the museum's grand entrance. The statue that depicts Roosevelt on horseback and flanked by a topless Indigenous and a topless African man had been the subject of decades of controversy. The current decision to remove it has been made not because of Roosevelt's known racism, but because of the visual composition of the statue that showed him on horseback and the two men trailing behind him. Ellen Footer, the museum's president, shared that the decision to remove a statue was made based on its, quote, hierarchical composition, end of quote, and not because of racism, Roosevelt's racism. All the way in the back of the building, the Addressing the Statue exhibition deals with the Museum of Natural History's complicity in promoting the history of eugenics in the early 20th century and provides a multifaceted perspective on Roosevelt, the ostensibly positive of his conservationist efforts, but also his racism. So this really is lieu de souvenir in action. So why do I refer to this instance rather than to your beautifully narrated and haunting example of the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel in New Orleans French Quarter? So there are some obvious parallels here. The exhibit in New York being placed at the back of a building on the ground floor, out of the way of usual visitor flows, much like the marker placed in the back of the hotel you're looking at, where guests are unlikely to go. So this demonstrates this tension of wanting to acknowledge on the one hand, without actually centering the bleak history and bringing this layering to the foreground. But there's a couple of other parallels between the American Museum of Natural History and the case of your hotel, of the New Orleans Hotel, that might help push lieu de souvenir a little bit further. So I will confine my comments to really two interventions. One that looks at what's at stake in processes of layering, and the second one on the concept itself. So first, on the question of layering. So the exhibition in New York really shows that providing a layered approach to racist history and decades of contestation is a multi-stakeholder process. And you allude to this in your paper as well. You imagine a kind of progressive convention of locals, historians, amateur and professional, politicians, artists, etc., getting together and thinking through that history together. In New York, this took the shape of a mayoral advisory commission on city art, monuments, and markers that was composed of a very diverse group of people, much like you imagine, and a group of people we would imagine to be left-leaning: visual artists, academics like the anthropologist Otto Simpson, architecture professor Mabel Wilson, and sociologist Richard Alba, and even Harry Belafonte. And yet somehow the commission was not able to reach consensus on what to do with the statue. So I wonder what this process would look like in places that are less friendly to historical reframing. I'm thinking here about the work on missing Holocaust memorials that Alexander Kowalski talks about in the case of Hungary, or the process-oriented work on the creation of nationalist memorials by Maura O'Shea, who writes about Kyrgyzstan, and of course the historical work on revisionist attempts by far-right activists to take these, to provide this kind of layering, but in a kind of alt-right revisionist mode. So what I want to get at here is that memory is a pendulum that really swings both ways. And so I'm kind of wondering how we can encourage a kind of progressive use of this layering and make sure that it doesn't, get reappropriated. Because of course we know how fickle historical facts are. Reinhard Koselleck, writing about Louis XVI's beheading, remarks that the only certain fact was that a guillotine separated his head from his body. If he was executed, murdered, or punished is a historical question, not one of facts. So I'm bringing this up because the case you suggest is one that seems deceptively straightforward. A Black woman and her children are sold as slaves with her children. But I wonder, what does lieu de souvenir look like once it goes beyond the acknowledgement of that fact and into kind of slightly more dicey, ambiguous territory where the facts aren't quite so clear? Who should be the people who are writing this layered history? Can we leave it to the mayor to put together a commission, to academics? What does it mean to create local stories and connect them to the national story? Given that a lot of states in which these sites are located are also red states, what can we expect in terms of accurate storytelling, in terms of building bridges? How can we prevent reappropriation? Imagine, General Lee gets, toppled and then Marjorie Taylor Greene gets erected instead. So that'd be a terrible thing to do. And less noxiously, as somebody who was born and raised in Germany, I would be remiss not to bring up Jewish-German sociologist Mikhail Bordeman, his work on memory theater, in which he points to the pernicious effects of memory when it gets politicized. So he really shows how the category of a Jew becomes reified without the actual participation of Jewish Germans in that, in many ways that are then wielded and used against Jewish Germans today. And lastly, if a project is an explicitly conciliatory one that builds bridges between communities that are polarized today, does this not stand in marked contrast to a nuanced project of historical layering, of bringing the past into conversation with the present? So you mentioned Danielle Allen's beautiful work, The Habits of Imagination That Generate Politically Transformative Experiences Among Strangers. And I'm wondering, how will this work and how could this work when the sides are so polarized? I'm of course also thinking in this context about work on imperial histories. So there's Ariella Aisha Azule's Potential Histories, of course, and Ricky Hammer's sociological theory piece on the kind of imperial heritage and in the ways in which we think on historical concepts. So layering the past might also have to rethink what the categories are that we use in order to rethink and relayer. And that brings me to the second point and kind of to the conclusion of my comment on the concept of lieu de souvenir. So you write in your paper a lot about the fraught history of Nora's lieu de mémoire concept that, of course, in wonderfully French and expectable fashion, erases historical legacies of colonialism and contemporary migrant groups. So given your own critique of a concept, I'm wondering why, apart from the name recognition factor, you chose to name it in a way that makes direct reference to it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. I was just kind of curious about your choices there. I also like the use of souvenir because compared to mémoire, it alludes to personal remembrance in many ways, rather than a kind of more technical or mechanical form of recalling facts that mémoire or even memory brings forward. At the same time, of course, there's the term collective memory that kind of overshadows any use of, rethinking the term memory. And I'm wondering how you think about it in that context. And souvenir, of course, is also tied to the idea of a memento or a keepsake, which in some ways kind of unfortunately reifies and materializes a past that you really want to be remembered in full detail, and your approach really pays so much attention to in terms of layering. And of course, lieu de souvenir does not immediately reference the core of your intervention and your contribution, which is a trans-temporal engagement with history, which I think was really beautiful. So I'm wondering if either by adding something to lieu de mémoire, lieu de souvenir, or changing it, you might be able to do more justice to your intellectual edifice and your political intervention. So I think to conclude, the idea of coining a concept for these processes of layering that are happening all around us, and not only in the US, but also elsewhere, these processes of augmenting individual memorials in order to reflect the history is really a worthwhile endeavor. And I would like to push you to think through what the concept does as an analytical concept that allows sociologists to describe these processes a little more. So to center lieu de souvenir as a mode of sociological analysis, in contrast to the mode of political action aimed at bridge building for local populations, which I think you start doing really well in the paper. So my main questions and pushes and nudges would be to think more, what can this do as an analytical concept and as a mode of political action? How does it engage in how can it engage in bridge building when there's so much politicization and so much opposition, especially by far-right, new white supremacist movements? Thank you so much.
Thank you for those comments. Those were wonderful. Angel, I'd like to give you a chance to respond before we can take comments and questions from the rest of the group.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anna, for such a very thoughtful and thorough response. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to start with your concepts on, your suggestions on the concept and why build on Pierre Nora and, the lieu de mémoire when I'm critical of it. So I'll start with, collective memory, which is so diffuse and so kind of large. And what I like about the lieu part of this is that it grounds in a specific place, at least for me, the way that I think about lieu de souvenir is it's very site specific. And that's what I'm trying to get at is it a specific place, a specific site. And so for souvenir, so I know it is, it's thought of as a memento, but I've been drawn to the etymology of souvenir. So sous, under, and venir, to come. So something that comes up from under. And so that is the way whenever I've written about souvenir, I go back to that etymology. It's something that comes up from under that has to be uncovered intentionally. And so that's the reason that I use it. So the lieu part of it anchors it in a particular site. And then the souvenir part of it alludes to that layering and taking this kind of archaeological approach to uncovering different layers. And so I've explained that in some other places where I've written about it. But that's the reason that I like it. I also do like contrasting it with lieu de mémoire, because the lieu de mémoire concept is so well known, and I do see this as a kind of cousin, almost a flip side in some way of lieu de mémoire. And so I think it's helpful to be in conversation with Nora there, because the lieu de mémoire is so well established. So people already have a sense of what that is. And then I can talk about how lieu de souvenir is in a kind of critical conversation with it, but it is disaggregating memory, disaggregating what's been taken for granted or what has become a kind of hegemonic memory. So I see that in some ways they might be kind of two sides of the same coin, so that something might function as a lieu de mémoire for one group, but then you might get a different group that has been marginalized that wants to turn that into a lieu de souvenir and have a more complicated discussion about that same site. And so those are all of the reasons that I've built on Nora's concept. So in terms of it getting at the transtemporal, For me, again, as I think about it as layers coming up from under the past, I think I think it does get across this idea of the transtemporal, if you're thinking about it with, coming up from under, that what has been buried is being archaeologically kind of uncovered again. So in terms of what's at stake in the layering process and the fact that it's a multi-stakeholder process, absolutely, and I think the questions you're asking are exactly right. Who gets to tell these stories? Is the mayoral commission going to be the one that we want to do this? I would suggest no. I don't think so. I can see all the ways that would go very much wrong. So I do have in mind scholars doing this kind of work, but I have in mind scholars doing this kind of work working in partnership with schools and with tourist sites. So for instance, I am on the board of 2 historic houses in the French Quarter that do historical house tours, right? And they both used to be owned by wealthy white Creole families that were slave owning. And so they have been going through this process, especially in the wake of protests last year, like so many others are, of how do we kind of recapture some of the stories that have been marginalized in the past. For one of them, they have a very robust database of enslaved persons that's linked to bills of sale, across time. And so, I was one of the advisors in helping them to create what they're calling an urban enslavement tour. And there are questions as to, should that be a separate tour, or should you redo the main tour to more center those stories? So those are all the kinds of questions in terms of different stakeholders. Right now, what they've decided is it's going to be an urban enslavement tour, but in our discussions, we have had that conversation about, well, why something separate, should it just kind of redo the whole tour itself and so on. So those are incredibly important. I guess my hope is that if scholars are at the forefront of doing this kind of work, and that they're working in conversation with historic sites and with K-12 educators, that we'd have a chance to get a perspective in there that would be more bridge building and less polarizing. And I think the other issue of so more ambiguous situations, or how do we encourage a more progressive use, I do really think that comes to my bias of the importance of education for very young people. So some of the work that I do in the community also works with very, very young people. I actually have a community, a nonprofit, a 501c3 that's community oriented, that works with children as young as 4 and 5, doing education. And so for me, that is where you start the training, so that if you can get in there earlier and work with educators, so that it's not a strange thing to ask these kinds of questions of sites across the city, that you have a chance. So, by the time you get to the mayor's commission and all the people who are coming together, you've got, you're dealing with something very different than you would be if you were able to actually form some good partnerships with K-12 educators and or with historic sites. And then the historic sites will often work with schools too. So there's this kind of, a lot of these connections that go together. So I guess I am optimistic, but I hope not blindly so. I hope in a way that is trying to cast a vision for what could be, and to invite others to join me in trying to make that vision reality. But I wouldn't say that I'm blind to all the ways that it could possibly go wrong.
Thank you. Maybe I'll kick off the next part with a question about how you see the role of artists in this. When I'm thinking of like a few things keep on going through my head, things that you have said, like racism as diseased imagination, and then also memory as a pendulum. And then as I was thinking about these ideas, the other thing that just keeps on intruding in my head is like thinking about how powerfully artists can intervene on memory, on imagination. And I'm thinking specifically, this is not about racial memory. When I teach theory now, I teach theory as a tool of the sociological imagination, right? So if we use theory to kind of try to think sociologically. And one of the things I show every year when I'm teaching Marx and the commodity fetish is a tape of an artist in LA who has done these incredible pieces where he makes cardboard cutouts of the people who work on the landscape and puts the cutouts like against like a very well-tailored bush, and for asking you to think about how that landscape came to be what it is and who did the work to actually make this space present to you the way it is. And it is also, I kept thinking of that example of like, he's like forcing our sociological imagination, forcing up the things, what is underneath, forcing up kind of, and in fact, making it so that people notice it when they wouldn't necessarily, what they wouldn't notice if they actually saw the person doing the work.
Mm.
And so it's this very powerful intervention. So that is a long way of saying, what do you think the role of art, how do artists fit into this, scholars, historians, students?
So I actually see a very prominent role for artists, and in fact, that's been really, I haven't spoken or written about it specifically, but I think that's just been my underlying assumption. That's certainly not my strength, but part of what I think about these multi-layered markers, I can't really conceptualize it without artists being engaged in it, because I'm not an artist, I don't create monuments. And so I think it really does take people with that kind of eye and that ability to think and engage in these really creative ways. So for instance, if what you were saying brings to mind the artist Woodrow Nash. So Woodrow Nash was commissioned to create this really kind of haunting children. They're I guess they're sculptures. They're sculpted children at the Whitney Plantation here in Louisiana. And if you ever get a chance to come to Louisiana, I very much encourage you to go to the Whitney Plantation. It's gotten a lot of renown because it is entirely devoted to telling the story of plantations from the perspective of enslaved people. And so the entire tour is that. And so Woodrow Nash has these kind of haunting sculptures of children throughout. You encounter them throughout your walking tour. And then they also have this wonderful app where you can listen to each different station that you visit. And it has, this excellent sound design. And so I think of that as, kind of the oral design as well, oral artists that help us to hear and enter fully into an experience. So they've got really sophisticated sound design together with interviews with scholars. And then you've got the visual with the Nash sculptures. And the whole thing is incredibly powerful. I've had some white friends who have said, yes, I've taken some of my other white friends to this plantation to try to break open their understanding and, to get to them in ways that I haven't been able to in just talking to them. And so it is a kind of embodied experience that brings together not just the scholarship, but also the visual and the oral arts to try to get through this message.
Yeah. Wow. The other thing that I keep on thinking of is the Watchman, which is like that, like so the first episode, that's like maybe a different conversation, but Jonathan.
Wow, so great. What a great Friday afternoon. I wanted to two thumbs up. I think on the Lieu de Souvenir, I loved your explanation. I thought at the academic level and the way that you position this, it works for me. I'm wondering how much that has to do with having a kind of francophone sensitivity, or like having that in the mix or not. And I don't know how well it's gonna strategically or pragmatically, how well it travels, but whatever. I mean, I don't, not sure, but like the things that also resonated as I thought about, like when I saw your title, even it, I think was the memoir as a more of a static. It exists, but in that existence, it's usually staked back. It has more of an official dimension. It's just memoir, right? It doesn't bring in the souvenir is reflexive, right? Je me souviens. Like it's personal. Like you said, it's from below. I like that. It was really great. It involves, there's a reflexivity, right? There's a dimension of that interaction, which I think you're capturing. And I think, I guess in doing that, kind of along with what Sarah was just talking about, I was wondering if there's like a multi-pronged, there isn't one like strategy of the academic interface. Like you were mentioning, okay, there might be some city officials that have been involved, but like the real terrain is K through 12. And I really like that mode, or kind of prioritization, I guess, is the battle is there, start there, and the means through which to do that may be like less, like there might be, I was just thinking of guerrilla gardening. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, where you just like throw seeds somewhere in like these spaces and you get, people just start growing tomatoes in a median or something like that. And I just was thinking this like unofficial, more spontaneous kind of, not totally spontaneous, but a little bit guerrilla-esque modes might be good, of like alternate cartographies. I know that geographers do a ton of this with, but like virtually, right? You can have an alternate map of a place, etc. And I think that those could then, because it's like in the long game, right? Then you're going to be able to, then you start to build a consensus, or you might, I'm more processing with you, because I think you're energizing us in really productive ways. I am currently involved in a team that's writing a people's guide to Morocco. There's a people's guide series out of UC California, which kind of it's like a guidebook for, there's one for LA, there's one for San Francisco, one for Boston, but it's a different kind of a tourist guidebook that looks at the city through the lens of power and contestation, and these various types of struggles. And I think multimedia ways that we can be engaged in that is remapping memory or whatever in that. So excited, Angel. Thank you again. It's nice to actually virtually meet you too, because I've loved your work for a long time. So
yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for these thoughts. And yeah, I think your contrast of memoir versus souvenir is a helpful one, right? Because souvenir, this is a verb, right? We are in the process of remembering, whereas, as you say, memoir is static. It is a memory, and so linguistically, that breakdown, and I think you're also onto something, how will this play in a largely Anglophone, or completely Anglophone, American sociological landscape? I think that's not trivial. I think I need to explain that more. But yeah, the contrast between memoir as a static noun and souvenir, and then also the reflexivity of je me souvenir, because in French, that's a kind of reflexive verb. So yeah, I think all of that makes sense and plays into that contrast between le de mémoire versus le de souvenir. So that's very helpful. And then when you talk about alternative cartographies, that is absolutely in line with what I have in mind. So for instance, part of in the work that I've been doing on this project, there is something called the Vieux Carré Survey, which is the historic New Orleans collection. So the Vieux Carré is just the French term for the French Quarter. And they have a survey where you can literally type in the address of any place in the French Quarter, and it will pull up for you photos from every historical period that they've got photos for, plans, like floor plans. They have a whole chain of title that shows you, where when it was first assigned, when the French came here in the early 18th century, and then who bought it from then on. So you see in that one address, the full chain of title, and then it's got, kind of just popular references on that same site in magazines, newspapers from 18th century to the present. So I do have in mind, this creative use of digital cartographies where you could, say if it was just the French Quarter or some other site, you could literally click through and see, from the settlement of New Orleans, how the cartography has changed or different ways of drawing that cartography. There are, some really interesting atlases that have done this as well, with alternative cartographies. And one that stood out to me is, I was in the textbook that I use that Mustafa Emirbayer has on race. At one point, I don't think they have it in there anymore, but I was using it to teach, and they had a map of the current United States, but instead of having states on it, it had different native groups and where they lived. And so the idea that you could superimpose, you could start with that, and then you could superimpose on that the various different maps of European settlement, where you had the Spanish and the French and the English who had different parts of the territory, and then superimpose on that, what it looked like after the Mexican-American War, and then superimpose over that, so it gives you this very layered access to understanding, to thinking about issues of power and social change over time. And so it's that way of thinking that I want young people to have, that you don't just look at a landscape or a city or a map and just say, that's what it is. That you're accustomed to actually seeing those layers literally peeled away before your eyes, and then to learning about the social and political and cultural struggles that led to those different layers.
It's such a powerful, one of the things that's striking me with this conversation is so often when we talk about what does it mean to be a publicly engaged scholar, we're talking about like what policy interventions versus this kind of intervention where it is like, how do we use this knowledge to structure memory itself? Katrina.
Thanks, Angel, for your talk. So I have a lot of reactions also, like not very particularly coherent comments, but my first reaction was that I was like, oh, I've been having all these feelings about the tearing down of like Columbus statues or whatever, not because I'm like particularly attached to Columbus statues or I think that they need to remain, but that I wonder about what happens in their wake and kind of what's lost in getting rid of these things. And so, for example, one of my friends is a descendant of Supreme Court Justice Fuller, who was a racist, whatever. And they're tearing down a statue of him, and the family is trying to decide what to do with this statue. And it made me think, like, shouldn't we remember that Justice Fuller was a racist? And so I just wasn't aware of this kind of public possibility or ways of thinking about what could be in that place and who could be involved in those conversations. So I just appreciate sort of you sharing this with us, and it gives me less, as somebody who's constantly concerned about remembering our racist history, it makes me feel like, okay, yeah, we can do both. We can move forward and still remember this because it's important. So that's just one reaction. The other thing I've been thinking about, I guess, as people talk, is sort of what the role of like tearing down statues or monuments is for healing and for redress, and what kinds of things are redressable, I guess is the way of putting it, and like who is responsible for that. And it makes me think of Gina Kim. She wrote a book recently called Post-Colonial Grief, and it's about US empire and colonialism in the Pacific, and sort of what do people do, how do Japanese, Korean survivors respond to, and how are they represented as victims, and how do they represent themselves as victims in creating memorials or in artistic endeavors. And one of the things that I was going to talk about it the other day, and one of the things we talked about was the Vietnam Memorial in this country, in the US, that it was, so I don't know if you all remember, but when the Vietnam Memorial in DC was put together, it was sort of heralded as like, oh, Maya Lin, this Vietnamese American, is going to design this beautiful memorial, and it'll sort of, speak to, in some ways, the terrible things that happened in Vietnam. But at the same time, what it does is it solidifies the memory of that war, of the US's imperialism, as the Vietnam War, when it was all over Southeast Asia, right? And all these other populations were involved. And so who gets to speak? And so Anna's comments also made me think of this, whose stories get to be told, and how do we then remember the thing? And like so even if it's like a coalition of people, I don't know if that's the right word, or if there's multiple stakeholders whose voices are represented. And so I don't mean to always be like, well, it's great that, there's great representation that Maya Lin did this, but what about? But I think it does raise the question sort of like how many histories can you contain in a plaque, for example? And then just outside of kind of that like more public facing interest in this, I am curious. And so I think that's all really important. It's given me like a good way to think about the social moment, which I think itself is like a really important contribution. I guess the other thing I'm thinking about is, how do you see this come? I'm wondering if you see like manifestations of this in our scholarship as like historical sociologists. Like, how do we correctly, improperly, maybe not enough, wrestle with layered memory in our own work? And what would sort of the implications of, I do not speak French, so please everyone forgive me, lieu de souvenir, be for our scholarship? So maybe that's like a less socially important question, but I'm just sort of curious as a historical sociologist as well. But again, thank you, and just giving me a lot to think about, as you can probably tell by my scattered comments.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, I think I'll start with the last one. It looks like Eric was interested in this question as well, about, as historical sociologists, how do we wrestle with the layered past, and how does this concept of lieu de souvenir potentially help us in that? So my hope is that it helps us by giving us a tool, especially as historical and comparative historical sociologists, that helps us to have a kind of structured and disciplined way of connecting past and present in ways that are meaningful. So specifically, thinking about what are our contributions as historical sociologists and comparative historical sociologists compared to historians, who we have many affinities with, but are still quite different from. So what do we bring to our historical work? And not that everyone who does this kind of sociology is necessarily committed to bringing past and present into dialogue. But for those who are, my hope is that the lieu de souvenir approach could be a tool that helps us to do this in a very clear and direct and disciplined way. I think there is more and more interest in that from everyday people who are wrestling with, why do we keep having these same issues? Why do we keep having, racial unrest? Like, we thought we dealt with that already. Well, in fact, here is why we are still dealing with it. And here are the clear connections to the past. And so my hope is that by using this very site-specific approach, and so the lieu de souvenir as concept, I've lost track of where I wrote it down so very carefully, but basically I said there are sites that are amenable to telling nuanced stories about transformations in power and status over time, something like that. So whereas technically any kind of site or building could be, you could use this lieu de souvenir. In fact, there are some places that are going to be better than others in telling a story that helps us to understand continuity and change over time and transformations and dynamics of power and so on. So as I was looking around New Orleans, I was, certainly very strategic in which sites I chose. And I chose sites that I could tell a story with, and that I could literally do this unpeeling from the beginning of settlement through to the present. And I chose places where I could use multiple methods, where there were archival methods that I am using, but where there are also people who I can interview and do oral histories with. So I chose sites that were amenable to these multiple methods and that were amenable to telling a really interesting and compelling story that gets at issues of for me, race and power and change, as well as continuity over time. So it's my hope that de Souvenir would become a tool that historical and comparative historical sociologists would routinely turn to. It would justify all the work I've been doing and make me feel like my life is worth something. but other than that, I'm hoping that it's useful for other people in the way that it's been useful for me. So I've used it in other ways. For instance, I have a piece on Congo Square, which is a place here in New Orleans where Africans of different ethnic groups and enslaved people who had been born in the Americas would come together to market and to dance on Sundays, especially, as well as other times. And, it's just a very, very rich site. And I looked at Congo Square over time. I started with the concept of Blackness and how Blackness is often talked about in this kind of monolithic way in the United States, and then used Congo Square to peel away the layers, going back to when that had been a place of distinctly different African ethnic groups, as well as people, enslaved people who had come over from colonial Saint-Domingue, which is present day Haiti. And then I showed how over time, especially when we get to the late 19th century, those differences were flattened, partly because you didn't have new arrivals coming. More and more people were born in the United States. So that's kind of natural increase as to why that the differences began to be flattened, but also because of the rise of Jim Crow, that you used to have, this kind of three-tiered racial society with Creoles of color in the middle, and that was squashed more and more by the end of the 19th century and flattened into this one category of Blackness. And so I tell the story of Congo Square as a way of unpeeling the layers of Blackness. And my purpose in doing that was also to get at the present day, the fact that when you look at the immigration literature, you will see that current immigrants of African descent, are often very much drawing boundaries between themselves and African Americans who were born here. And then African Americans in turn are often, kind of drawing these invidious distinctions too, and saying, these people are not like us and they think they're better than us and so on. And so part of what I was doing with that was to look back to a time where these groups, especially groups from the Caribbean, were part of building what is now the United States, rather than seeing them as being exogenous to the United States. So people of Haitian descent helped to build New Orleans. Black Bahamians were very central to building Miami well before there was any large immigration of people from the Caribbean. Miami was only incorporated in 1896, and it was Black Bahamian labor, as well as labor from Jamaica, and some African Americans who built Miami. And so you had, and there's some really good scholarship looking at a place called Colored Town in Miami that looks at these very different Black origins in Miami in the late 19th and early 20th century, before you had the major immigration from Latin America and the Caribbean. So I was trying to use that Congo Square and the lieu de souvenir approach to say, if you go back to some of the earlier establishment of key cities, that you do see a lot of Black diversity there that is built into who we are. It's not just, this later immigration that, oh, all of a sudden we're more diverse than we used to be.
Looking at the time, I think we have time for the comment by Anna, and then we'll give you the last word, Angel, and then maybe we'll spend just like a quick couple seconds checking in about the group itself. If that's all right with everybody, that's what I propose.
Right,
Sorry.
really short in that case. So I wanted to pick up on something Katrina mentioned about redress. And so again, coming at it from a sort of negative perspective, not negative towards your project, but negative towards how people have made use of collective memory historically. What we've seen in Germany is that there has been a lot of memory and not a lot of redress, right? And so I think your approach of making things local is very, very promising in that sense, because it isn't like there is one, top-down approach that dictates how is memory to be done. And so I think that is like very, very promising compared to what is happening in Germany and has happened in other countries. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, how are you thinking, or are you thinking at all about tying this to questions of reparation, of investing into neighborhoods that have been underserved? You just talked about the beautiful history of like Miami and New Orleans being built by different groups of Black immigrants, of centering the history and giving something back to the community as well. So thinking about material and non-material forms of redistribution, and how you're thinking about it in the context of the work that you are doing in terms of education.
Good question. So I have another piece that uses this Lot de Souvenir approach and takes as the unit of analysis Treme in New Orleans. And some of you may know Treme from that HBO show Treme. So Treme is, an incredibly historic place. That was the area that many of the activists of Plessy versus Ferguson came from, who were largely French-speaking Creoles of color, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I use this Lot de Souvenir analysis in Treme to look at transformations over time. And one of the key transformations is that it has historically been a place where there was a very large number of free people of color and later Creoles of color who engaged in really wonderful building trades and created, historic housing structures and so on. A very large portion of this was razed to make way for Louis Armstrong Park. Another portion was devastatingly razed for the I-10 highway. Literally the same story. The same thing happened in Miami with Overtown and I-95. And it's just a depressingly similar story throughout the country of just historic Black neighborhoods, the heart of the business and the residential area destroyed. So what I do in that piece is, again, very systematically unpeel the layers from the Frenchmen who went to live up there and create bricks with enslaved labor in the early 18th century, looking through to free people of color and Creoles of color really becoming dominant in that area, coming into the destruction of that very rich community, not completely destroyed, but very much compromised. And then coming up to the present in the 21st century, where it's now gentrification. And so now you have, it's much wider and much wealthier and very aggressively Airbnb'd, like very aggressively Airbnb'd. And so, I kind of end that piece with a question of, so as we turn back and look at this history and look at, what's been significant, how does that poise us to think about these questions going forward of what are we going to make of this place? And I think that gets directly at your question about redress and reparations. And so part of what I would hope would come out of that is directly this question of, are we willing to allow this to be completely lost? We see how it's been compromised already. We can see in the landscape today and the population and demographics today how it's rapidly being compromised. I know a similar process happened in Harlem. And I lived in Harlem while some of this was happening. It was quite extraordinary to see. So I think there was a very direct a very direct connection between that kind of history and asking these questions. And here's where I would see needing to connect very directly with city leaders, to say what kinds of policy options can we make or create here so that we don't lose this. Unfortunately, as we know in the US, we're very much driven by the market, and the market colonizes pretty much everything else, and that it seems to be the only value usually. But I think it takes more of us to come together to say that's not the only acceptable value that we're going to use. And we care too much about this place and these people, and from a very cynical point of view, who wants to come to New Orleans to see a lot of, wealthy, kind of gentrifiers who have driven all of the distinct culture out of Treme? That's not the reason that people are coming here as tourists. So if we have to, go back to that kind of, crass rationalization, we could say, this is no good anyway for the bottom line and for tourism in the city if all we have are wealthy, mostly white gentrifiers in a place that used to have this dense African-American culture. So in the end, if we must come back to the economic argument, we could come back to the economic argument, but I think having the historical scholarship there is at least some important piece of the conversation.
Thanks. And actually, we have one more hand up, so we'll sneak one more in.
It's me, because I never really put my hand down. I just keep it there all the time so I can keep talking. I really appreciated your example of Congo Square, and it made me think about space and place. And I think a bunch of you were in the salon talk on revolutions, I think, and this kind of the spatial turn, I guess, came up in that too. And so I've just been thinking about what is the payoff of studying a particular site over time? I think we're all into studying things over time. That's why we're here, right? But a particular site, like a coffee shop or this square. And so the story you tell about heterogeneity in the Black population in the United States is one that I think is really important. And so what do we get from telling it in that square versus hey, telling it in a way that's maybe more spatially diffuse. And I'm into it, but I think I just haven't yet articulated it. And I guess I'm just wondering for everybody else here too, would you say that comparative historical research has become increasingly concerned with space and place in the last X number of years?
So I'll raise my hand and then sneak in what I'm thinking of is listening to this talk, I'm all right, here's what I want to do. I want to do a class that's an experiential learning comparative historical class now with my undergrads, where we all get together and their job is to read your piece and then read about Seattle history and identify places where we could do this.
Wow.
Right? And then put together a proposal, who would you talk to in the local government? Who do you talk to, who's stakeholders in that space? And make something. And what the class does is do this. And I don't know, my hope for this specific group that we're in is and we have a structure where we could potentially work together to put together a syllabus or a project like this that we could do in a bunch of places. So that is what I will say, it's less about our research and more about our teaching. But right now I'm well, this is the class I want to teach next year with my undergrads is how would we do that here in Seattle and have them do it. So.
I think that's amazing. That's a really exciting vision. I love it. I love it. Yeah, and I think in terms of collaboration, it would be amazing to be able to kind of have this network where we've done that for our respective cities, so part of what, I don't know if I worked it all the way into this presentation, but the, kind of the vision piece or the vision slide that I showed was this idea of scholars working together with others in the community. It could be that the city would be part of it, but also depending on the city and the resources, here we have a number of really wonderful archives, not all associated with the city. We have the Historic New Orleans collection, which has a lot of our really beautiful and in-depth archives. And I know they would be the kinds of people who might be interested in working with us. So depending on, the local resources you have, museums, archives, cities, and so on, I think if there were a way to kind of collect that information so that it's user-friendly, like what I described with that French Quarter survey, where you can just type in an address and instantly get this whole breakdown of I just think it's brilliant, or where you build something and, as Anna's saying, artists, could be part of it, cartographers, geographers, where you could work with them to create a website that allows you to, at the click of a button, have these layered maps so that you could just kind of keep clicking on the next layer of a map over time, which shows you some of the cultural, social, political, geographic transformations. So I think if there's a way to choose a specific site and then gather the different data that then a multidisciplinary group could put together in a user-friendly way, probably housing that at a university, that would probably be my first go-to, just because you never know what's going to happen at the city level when a new administration comes in. And then when you get into private archives and you have other accessibility issues. So my hope would be that if universities could help to house that, but make it public, that would be really powerful and could be used by students across the country to kind of get a better sense. But it's a really important way, I think, for local students to really understand their local context and to be placed there. And that's part of what Katrina was asking is, what's the payoff of studying a specific space over time? I think especially when we are in that space or rooted in and living in that space, is then being able to make those connections to policy as well, that we have a stake, we have a particular stake, and then we're also building on particular scholarly knowledge. So it gives you a rootedness to be able to do the analysis, especially if you're on site and you've got access to the local physical archives. But then also in terms of politics, it gives you a stake too.
Adam has his hand up, and then maybe Anna can join us with those comments that you included.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond quickly to Katrina's question about so who else is doing this. I had to hop off on the revolutions one, but one of the things so I've been thinking about space for a long time and I've struggled to actually get people to talk about it. But just because we're short on time, but the quick response I want to give is that there are actually programmatic statements on the study of place and space by Tilley and Sewell going back to 2001. But it's targeted to social movement scholars, but they're obviously at the intersection of movements and historical sociologists. And the reason why I'm thinking about this is I'm writing a piece trying to get people to talk about space as part of historical explanation, which Tilley in, as Sociology Meets History said basically, explanation is historical to the extent that it evokes time and space. But so much of what we have done evokes narrative, which is largely about dependence over time and temporal context. We don't do as much with space, even though if you go back, I'm thinking about Vision and Method, where there's this sort of the chapter on Mark Bloch, right, in feudal history, right, where a lot of it is about using these maps, right? There's like a long history of this, a Null school, certainly. So there is actually sort of a long history of spatial analysis. It's just something that, so when people are like, yeah, this seems like something we should focus on, I'm like, yeah, I totally agree. It's something that we have not sort of systematized. No. So I agree, and just sort of wanted to throw those things out there if you want to sort of see people talking about it in sort of, and a lot of this is connected to the dynamics and contention literature that was sort of around in the early 2000s, where it was thinking about context as being hugely important. In classic examples, Gould's, Insurgent Identities is very much a story about architecture and space and political identity. This is a very different way of using it, I think, than what Angel's doing. And particularly because place is a way of evoking notions of culture that is sort of somewhat different than the abstract space if you're doing, like, for me, doing sort of quantitative stuff. But there are lots of ways I think that this can be brought in.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I think drawing on that older literature is important. And I guess that is a good question as to why we haven't been as attentive to space and place. I guess one answer is we're not geographers, maybe. But on the other hand, you know, I think it's a very useful tool to get into these social and political questions, you know. So no, I don't necessarily want to turn our students all into geographers. But on the other hand, I think geography is so important for the social and political questions that we ask. And so my hope again is that this kind of very site-specific approach of the lieu de souvenir could maybe make it possible for what can sometimes, I know when I have years ago, I was doing interesting reading on space and place, and it was just so big. It was just so conceptually felt very abstract, and it just was hard for me to wrap my mind around what to do with it. And so I tend to think very concretely. Thanks, Jonathan. Married to a geographer who always reminds me that sociologists don't have to reinvent the wheel. Exactly. So, you know, for me, that this concept of the lieu de souvenir just makes it very user friendly. You know, and yes, Lefebvre is not the one I turn to when I want to, you know, just have this very succinct, clear approach to now, what am I going to do? Which archives am I going to go to? When it's very site specific, then you have, you know, property records, you've got archival records, you've got, you know, potential, you know, bills of sale. You have all sorts of very concrete things that you can use in terms of your data that can tell you a story. And I've just found it to be a very useful way to get at these issues of place and also of space.
All right, if I just wrap it up as per Sarah's invitation. I, you know, Jonathan's comment about like not needing to reinvent the wheel, you know, as I'm looking at the names I dropped into the chat as of people who are doing similar work, I'm wondering if we're also looking at a kind of disciplinary, different continental disciplinary conventions. The people I mentioned are largely in the United Kingdom, where sociology has a kind of less hostility towards the humanities. The people in the US, like Kavita Kulkarni, came from a media, culture, and communications department, is now in digital humanities. And I think people are doing it a lot there. In terms of the reactions I've gotten to my own work about doing visual analysis, I've often been told, oh, this is not, you know, not real sociology. And only when I got into the supremely technical aspects of, you know, well, not that technical, linear algebra and computer vision, and making it really technical and masculine, then people were like, oh, this is great, this is definitely sociology, and we will pay you a lot of money to do this. So I'm kind of wondering if there, how we can fight against this devaluation of the visual, this devaluation of thinking through space. I mean, ethnographers do this a lot, right? And so maybe one way of legitimating this type of work could be by kind of very specifically collaborating with and strengthening ties with ethnographers to position oneself in the field. And I'm kind of wondering how you're thinking about that as somebody, you know, you're a full professor now, right, Angel?
Associate, still associate, lingering
associate. But yes, just thinking about, you know, what does it mean for comparative historical sociologists as we are situated in a particular time and place that has particular ideas about what good comparative historical sociology is and what it isn't, that has a predilection for certain methods. It prefers quantitative methods over, you know, visual and kind of layering methods that you propose. And so I'm kind of wondering how to think about that in terms of education of undergraduates, but also in terms of making the field richer.
That's a hard one. I'm not sure I will be able to resolve that in the next 30 seconds.
If anyone can, though.
But I think it's real. You know, yeah, it is something that we have to think very carefully about. that gets into many other frustrations I have with academia at the moment, which I, alas, cannot get into. But yeah, I mean, there are real concerns, constraints, and so on. If I were writing this, as an assistant professor, would this be a concern? Perhaps, perhaps not. I've tended to be the kind of person who does what I want to do anyway. So I don't know. I guess at a certain point, though, it's this very delicate balance of, perhaps it is something for more senior faculty to pave the way with, so that it becomes acceptable, so that it's easier for younger scholars to do. That way, we don't put our younger scholars at risk, so we allow them to be able to advance and get tenure. But for those of us who are senior faculty, to really pave the way with legitimizing it would be really, really important. And since we have the flexibility to do that, I think that's really important. So I think your question and concern there is definitely a significant one that we have to think about.
Thank you so much. My mind is blown from this whole conversation. I guess I would say this is normal. We don't have a big group, so I don't think we go into the full meeting. But in lieu of so first, let's do this, a round of applause for that awesome presentation.
Thank you all for the great conversation.
Great work. And then the second meeting-ish thing I guess I would say is, maybe as a follow-up, I will reach out if people are interested, and maybe probably the summer, because right now I'm in the full chaos of the end of the academic year. Putting together, using the teaching group to put together some kind of effort where maybe we reach out to some of the scholars that Anna's mentioned in the list, or I reach out to you, and we maybe can use the teaching working group to build up a syllabus for something like this that maybe people could easily adapt different places.
Very cool.
To institutionalize some of the kind of amazing work you're doing, because it's really exciting, and I think there's a lot of people who would want to follow in this.
I would love to be part of it, so just definitely count me in.
Yay! I'm excited. All right. Does anybody have anything else they want to say? All right, then a last round of applause. Thank you so much.
Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful. Thanks.
All right. Take care, you all.
Take care.